misinformation. And so I think previously we had talked about local advocacy, and now we're bringing somebody here who can speak a little bit about federal advocacy. So we're going to look at one of those today. How does the topic today fit into addressing distrust and misinformation about science? Well, it fits into the informed action part of the process, because informed action doesn't just mean going out and talking with people. It can, and it definitely does. It doesn't just mean maybe writing an op-ed or educating yourself, or going and having conversations, or any number of other things. But part of it is potentially practicing advocacy. And so we want to, if we do that, do it effectively. And federal advocacy is one way to proactively address misinformation. And the thought behind this is that if we advocate for informed action on climate change, we may move policy away from misinformed action. And here's some statistics to sort of center you from the Yale program on climate change communication. Only 1% of registered voters in the United States of America said they are currently participating in a campaign to convince elected officials to take action to reduce global warming. While 65% of registered voters in the US say that developing sources of clean energy should be a high or very high priority for the president and Congress. 74% of people in the US think global warming is happening, and only 11% of people in the US are dismissive about climate change. And these numbers fluctuate up and down slightly year to year and season to season, but it looks roughly like this. So with that, I think I will turn it over to our very capable guest, Charlotte Shelton.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Selton. I am APS's Member Advocacy Senior Associate, so I'm a member of our Government Affairs team, where I manage our grassroots and our grass top advocacy programs. And I am going to go ahead and share my slides. Give me a second to get them up. All right, and while I do this, just to give folks a quick run of show so you know what to expect. First, I'm going to give a brief presentation walking you through how you can get meetings with Congress, what to expect from meetings with Congress, and how to make sure that you effectively communicate with Congress. Then there will be some time for questions. And then we will have a breakout room workshop where you can think through and come up with some stories that you could use in a congressional meeting to advocate. All right, so I'm gonna dive right in. I know that as Zach mentioned, some of you attended my colleague Julie Davis's talk about advocacy on the local level. So today's going to be different because I'm going to be focusing on federal level policy and talking about how you can DIY, do your own congressional meetings at the federal level to advocate or educate on federal policy. If you have any clarifying questions while I'm talking, if I say something that you don't understand, please write it in the chat. And Zach and Allie, if you don't mind just unmuting and interrupting me so that I know that there's a question there. If you have a bigger question, please save that until the Q&A portion. And we'll have time then to answer. But thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be here today. All right. So firstly, why do we need to even have a talk about how to speak to Congress? I know that in the Science Trust, you've been trained on speaking to the public, and is that really any different? So the first thing I want us to think about is whether Congress is representative of the public. So take a look at this chart. This is the professional backgrounds of the current members of Congress. So this is senators and representatives all put together. And think about what you notice in this chart. Please feel free to write any observations in the chat. And Zach and Allie, if you see anything there, please unmute and read it aloud. I imagine that some of you might have the very reasonable question, what is this massive other category that 43% of Congress falls into? So that's mostly folks who are either career public servants or are business owners, entrepreneurs who have 4-year degrees, as well as veterans.
Charlotte, can you clarify what a JD stands for or represents?
Absolutely. So a JD, a Juris Doctora, that is lawyers. So there is a massive number of lawyers in Congress, about a third of Congress. Is that reflective of the public at large? Not really, but that is what Congress has. You also might notice this itty bitty yellow sliver at the top, which is the less than 1% of Congress that is PhD scientists. So we actually only have 5 PhD scientists in Congress right now. We have 1 chemist, 1 psychologist, 1 public health scientist, 1 animal scientist, and of course, 1 physicist, Representative Bill Foster. Representative Foster is a high energy physicist who worked 22 years at Fermilab. So if you're in the high energy field, you might know him. So Congress legislates on lots of science-informed policy areas, including climate change policy, but barely any members of Congress are scientists. That's why it's really important for policymakers to hear from scientists, from folks like you. Most members of Congress are not technical experts, but they're asked every day to legislate on technical issues. But of all the ways that you could communicate with Congress, you could write them an email, you could call them on the phone. Why are we focusing today on congressional meetings? So the Congressional Management Foundation is a nonprofit that works to build trust and effectiveness in Congress. And one of the ways they do that is by regularly surveying congressional staff and then sharing those results both with advocacy professionals and Congress. So one of their questions from a few years back was assessing what advocacy strategies to engage congressional offices are most impactful when an office hasn't yet made up their mind on an issue. So here are the results from that question. And as you can see, by far the number one advocacy strategy is in-person issue visits. This survey was done before the pandemic, and it was before virtual meetings were a common practice. They are now common, easy to do. Congress is very much used to Zoom at this point. And the Congressional Management Foundation has actually done some follow-up surveys poking at the difference between virtual and in-person visits in terms of the effectiveness. The general takeaway is that they're practically as good as one another. There is still a slight edge for in-person meetings, but especially when you consider the cost, both financial and climate cost of traveling to DC, you may also often find that virtual meetings are really your better bet. Also note, way down at the bottom, visit from a lobbyist. They would much rather hear from folks who they represent, folks who are not there because they're paid to be there. They would like to hear from people like you. So I encourage you to think seriously about meeting with Congress if you've never done so. So why would you meet with Congress? What's your goal in the meeting? There are 2 common reasons why you might want to meet with Congress. The first would be to advocate, and the second would be to educate. And sometimes folks use these terms as if they're synonyms, but there's an important difference. And that is that if you're in an advocacy meeting, you're there to ask them to support or oppose a specific policy. So maybe you're asking them to fund a certain program or to vote against a certain bill, but there is something you want them to do based on the information you're giving them. If it's an educational meeting, then you're there to provide factual information or technical expertise, but you are not telling them what the takeaway should be, what they should do with that information. If you work for a government agency or a public university or any other public organization, and you're taking a meeting on behalf of that organization, education is basically always permissible. Advocacy may not be. So that's just one thing to be aware of.
Charlotte, we have
How do you,
a question.
go ahead. Mhm.
In the chat says, by meet with Congress, do you mean meet one-on-one with a single representative, or a small group, or a large group, or all of the above? How does that work?
So I mean, meet either by yourself, or if you want to do it with a group, you could, with a congressional office. So often you'll be meeting with congressional staff, not the member of Congress or senator themselves, just because, as you can imagine, their schedules are very busy. But meeting directly with the congressional office is what I'm talking about. All right, so how do you get a meeting? So one thing to remember is that lawmakers have a lot of people asking for their attention. The average House district is over 760,000 people. And if you're from California, your senators each represent over 40 million people. So you can imagine how many folks they might be hearing from in just one day. That's why it's really important to be prepared and do some research before you even reach out to an office. So before reaching out, I recommend that you have figured out what you want to talk about. Don't just take a meeting because you think it would be fun. You should have a goal that you're trying to achieve, whether that's educating or advocating. Then you'll want to research that office to figure out how to contact them for a meeting. You might find a phone number, you might find an email address. Some offices have a meeting request form on their website. So you'll have to do a bit of digging to figure out what the best way is. Then whatever topic you're hoping to discuss, let's say it's something really narrow, like you are asking them to vote for a particular bill, think about what broader policy topic that bill falls under. So is this about energy? Is it about natural resources? Is it about education? It's useful to have figured out what broader policy topic your meeting falls under, so that when you reach out for a meeting, you can tell them that you'd like to speak with someone who has expertise in that area. Congressional staff each have different legislative portfolios. So that way they can match you up with someone who will have the background to have a productive meeting with you. Then also take stock of your own schedule. If you are only available to meet 1 hour in the next 4 weeks at 8 p.m., this isn't a good time to request a meeting. Ideally, you'll have a couple of days where you have broad availability, so you can let them know that you can make any time they have available work on those days, or within a few windows on those days. The more flexible you can be, the better your odds are of getting a meeting with the person you want and the office you want. So then when you're ready to make contact with the office, one of the first things you should do is identify as a constituent. And by that, I mean, make it clear immediately that you live in the district or state that they represent. They are most interested in hearing from their constituents. If you live in a different state, you're unlikely to get a meeting. So you want to make sure that they understand that they are beholden to you. You are represented by them. However, do not say whether or not you voted for this individual or whether you've ever donated money to their campaign. That can actually hurt your odds of getting a meeting. Nobody wants to be perceived as being willing to take bribes. They don't want to have to worry about whether this might be called a quid pro quo. So just let them know you're a constituent and you want to talk. That's enough. Don't get into the election campaign stuff. And then finally, be prepared to be persistent. As I said, they have a lot of folks that they represent, and they have very busy schedules and very busy email inboxes. So if you haven't heard back from the office in a week or so, follow up. And if you've sent 3 emails and haven't heard back, then maybe it's time to find a phone number and give them a call or reach out on Facebook. If you're persistent, your odds of getting a meeting are very good. So what should you expect from a congressional meeting? As I already said, you're almost always going to be meeting with a congressional staffer rather than the policymaker themselves. Congressional staff are often young. and they may not have any technical background, but these are influential and talented and dedicated folks. And most importantly, they are trusted by the policymaker to advise them on key decisions, which makes them really critical ears for you to have. These meetings, if you've never taken one, are almost always friendly and non-combative. It's not like an interaction you might see on Twitter, even when it's an office where you really disagree on the policy topic. They're going to approach you as a constituent, as a voter, and even when they disagree, they'll typically listen respectfully, and then explain why they don't agree on a policy topic. These meetings also aren't very long. They're typically 15 to 30 minutes. And even if you have a 30-minute meeting scheduled, there's always the chance that something will come up on the floor and they'll have to step away early. So it's important to make the most of your time in these meetings. That's why it's useful to send materials ahead of time for whoever you're meeting with to review in advance, so that you can dive right into the substance of what you want to talk about. All right, so what does a typical meeting look like? So I've broken it down here into a few different steps. So first, please do introduce yourself. There's no need to neglect the small talk, even though I just said how short these meetings are. The introductions are really your chance to forge a personal connection with the person you're talking to and start building trust. So you don't want to skip this step. Next, we encourage you to let them know what your main ask is. So what do you want to discuss in the meeting and what do you want them to do about this? I know that this isn't the typical way that we might approach things as scientists. You might be used to first giving the evidence and the background and building up to your main point, but because time is of the essence here, it's really important to lead right off the bat with your main purpose. Then we encourage you to bring in a personal story to explain why you're asking them to do this. You don't need to be an expert on a policy issue to be an effective advocate. And a personal story can actually be more impactful than facts, than dry facts like statistics, because it's memorable. It also can demonstrate the impact on their constituency. So no member of Congress represents the entire country. They all represent their district or their state, and they want to know how a policy impacts their district or their state. When you explain how it impacts you and you live in their district or their state, you're proving that this is a policy that impacts their constituency. Then, if there's time in the meeting and if that feels like the way that the meeting's going, you could bring in some supporting arguments. I recommend that you prioritize local connections or local arguments when you have them, and also prioritize any arguments that you think are likely to resonate with the policymakers' priorities. So do some research on the office you're meeting with ahead of time. Know what they've demonstrated they care the most about. For example, if you see that they've done a lot of work around small businesses, then see if there's a way that you can tie whatever issue you're discussing to economic competitiveness. And also leave room for questions. I recommend that you don't plan more than about half of your meeting so that there's room to just discuss and go with the flow. And then finally, when your time's up, you'll want to wrap up by reiterating the ask. So tell them again what you want them to do, what the main takeaway for this meeting should be. So one-pagers, like you see here, are a great tool to help streamline your meetings. Don't worry if you cannot read this. I am going to zoom in. As you can see, though, you don't need to be a graphic designer to make a one-pager. I made this in Microsoft Word. And the goal of a one-pager is to summarize the issue that you're there to discuss and make it as easy to skim as possible. So use bullet points, break things into sections, use bold or highlight whenever it makes sense, and put data in charts or diagrams as much as possible. So this is a sample one-pager about the Noyce Scholars Program, which is an NSF program that aims to recruit more qualified K-12 STEM teachers by providing forgivable loans to students who are pursuing teaching as a career. You really don't need to know more about the program than this. This is really just to give you an example of the structure of a one-pager. So the one-pager can be sent to the staff ahead of time, And then you can also have a copy in the meeting with you, and actually use this to kind of follow the flow of your meeting. So you'll see that this one pager follows the same order that we were just talking about. So it starts with the ask at the very top so that they know what you want them to do. Then there's some background information. This is where you can tell personal stories. Then further down in the one pager, we have supporting arguments, and some space where you could add local statistics or local anecdotes. And then finally, at the bottom of that one pager, we restate the ask again. So one pagers can be a useful tool, but don't feel like you have to follow it exactly. Don't make it, don't feel like you can't be flexible if the meeting is going a different direction. Sometimes you'll have a staff member or a member of Congress who's very informed on the issue or very enthusiastic, really just wants to have a discussion. It's perfectly fine to go with the flow there, and see what they want to talk about. So I'm going to do a quick stop here for questions, and then we will go into storytelling for some practice. So any questions?
Feel free to type your questions in the chat or to use the raise hand feature, which you'll find under the reactions button at the bottom of the screen. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, Charlotte, I had one that I think maybe other people would find useful, which is when you are requesting a meeting, do you have to specify if you're requesting one for advocacy purposes versus education purposes?
You don't need to specify that, but I encourage you to say what you want to discuss in that meeting. So normally when we at APS are scheduling meetings on APS members' behalf, we will say in like a sentence what they're looking to talk about. For example, we might say, this constituent is eager to talk to you about the Keep STEM Talent Act. And then we also will say what type of staffer would be most appropriate. So we would say like they would be eager to talk to Senator whatever, or the staffer that handles science issues in your office.
Gotcha. Thank you. Looks like Dimitri is asking if you could just go back to the previous slide. They might have a question. The one previous. And then while Dimitri's looking that over, there's another question that came in about what is a good way to know about that or about bills that are coming up for a vote.
So that is a great question. So it depends what you mean by a vote. There are committee votes and then there are floor votes. So most bills die in committee. That's just the reality of Congress. So a bill gets introduced, it gets referred to committee, and then most bills never again see the light of daylight. So if you want to know if it's going to get a committee vote, the best way to find out about that is to reach out to whoever the bill sponsors are. They might know if there's any movement, if there's any chance. Or if you want to help it get a committee vote, then reaching out to the members of Congress that are on that committee, especially whoever the leadership of that committee is, and pushing them to give this at least discussion in the committee is the best way to move that forward. If you're talking about a floor vote, again, useful to talk to the sponsors of the bill. They might know before it's public information. But you can also look at the schedules of what is scheduled to be discussed and voted on. Congressional schedules are public.
We had another question. It says, as scientists, we really like to emphasize citing our sources. I see a few footnotes in this document, but not as many as I might expect. How important is it that a one-pager has a thorough bibliography?
So that's a great question. We typically do include footnotes in our the one pagers that we make for advocates to take into meetings. And I do think that it makes sense to provide some footnotes when you're creating a one pager. But I also encourage you to maybe put your contact information at the bottom and say, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. Because there's also the goal of creating a relationship with an office and having opportunities to continue the discussion. And one easy way to make that happen is if they have a question that you don't have the answer to immediately, you can say, that's a great question. Let me get back to you on it. And then you have an opportunity to re-engage them on the issue. So essentially, footnotes are good, but please don't feel like you have to footnote everything or have a massive bibliography if you don't have space on your one-pager. It's perfectly fine to instead let them know that you can be a resource and you're happy to continue discussing it.
There was another question that came in. It says, IEEE and maybe APS or AAAS periodically organize a group of members to attend a Meet with Congress program. How would this type of program compare with the type of focused interaction you're discussing today?
That's a great question. So I'm most familiar with APS's Congressional Visits Day. So we have 1 to 2 a year. We have one that's attached to the annual leadership meeting, and we have one that is attached to the department chairs meeting in June. So the major differences there, though it depends on how you choose to do your meetings, but the way that we do Congressional Visits Day is we put people into teams, and those teams generally span more than one congressional district and often more than one state. So often you're going to some meetings where you are not actually the constituent, someone else on your team is. If you were scheduling this meeting for yourself, to assume that you are the constituent. You're not talking to an office that doesn't represent you. Because we put folks in these teams, they also are typically meeting with 4 to 6, maybe even 7 offices in one day. Your congressional delegation is 3 people, unless you live in Washington, D.C. like me. So you have 2 senators and 1 representative. So typically 3 meetings would be the most federal congressional meetings that you would have if you're scheduling just for yourself. And then a final major difference is that when we have Congressional Visits Day, we're typically giving folks as many as 5 policy topics to bring to those offices and talk about. However, their meetings aren't any longer. They're still 15 to 30-minute meetings, and they're normally trying to discuss at least 3 policy topics in that one meeting. So they're not getting as in-depth on those topics as you might be able to get if you are scheduling a meeting just for yourself on just one topic.
Thanks, Charlotte. I don't see any other questions yet, so I think we are good to go on.
All right. Go back up. Okay. So now we're going to dive deeper on storytelling. So when I say storytelling, I really do mean a story with that traditional story arc that you probably had to study in school. So think about your story in terms of the exposition, the conflict, and the resolution. So an ideal story in advocacy is going to be from the state or district of the person you're talking to. It's going to demonstrate the problem that whatever you're asking for would solve. So ideally, your conflict is whatever the problem is. And it's also going to offer some resolution. It doesn't have to be a Disney story with a happy ending. You could tell a sad story. It might be a story that's already happened because a policy wasn't in place, and so it had an unhappy ending. That's okay. That's the reality that we're facing. You can also tell a happy ending, a speculative story where it is what'll happen in the future if you pass this bill or if you spend this money. So the scenario that we're going to be working with for this activity is, imagine this. So Congress is considering cutting funding for clean energy research and development from the upcoming budget. So you are here to ask them to instead continue to make strong investments in clean energy research to help address climate change. So the goal here is just to brainstorm a personal story, not to practice telling the whole story or to practice the rest of the meeting. And we're going to break you up into breakout rooms of 2 to 3 people. So you'll have a chance to talk about it, and then we'll pull you back. And if you want, you'll have a chance to share out. But just to give folks who may not have a clear idea of what kind of story we're talking about here, an example, I will give you a personal story of my own. I currently live in Washington, D.C., where I don't have any voting federal representation. So I'm going to tell this as if I still lived in my hometown, which is Sacramento, the state capital of California. So Sacramento, can see a lovely picture of it there, is a gold rush town. And we've been known for now over a century as the city of trees, but actually we didn't start out with trees. Settlers started planting trees in what was a grassy valley when they started settling during the gold rush, because Sacramento gets so hot in the summer. Folks wanted the shade. We do have a relatively temperate climate. We have very mild winters and it rarely freezes, but our summers are hot and they're very dry. I remember lots of childhood summer days when I would spend it swimming in the river and relaxing in the shade of our parks, just to try to beat the heat for a few hours. However, even by high school, that was starting to change. So I had to actually take 6 weeks of summer physical education to graduate high school. Ugh, I know. And during just those 6 weeks, we had multiple days that we were forced to stay inside all day, either because the heat was dangerously high outside or smoky air quality from local fires made it too dangerous for us to be outside for any extended period of time. Unfortunately, since I've graduated, the situation has only got worse. Last summer had the hottest temperature on record in Sacramento, which was 116. And those records actually go back to 1878. I don't know how many of you have ever been outside in 116-degree heat, but it's otherworldly. It feels heavy on your skin, and it feels unpleasant to breathe. Any outdoor exertion risks heat stroke or even death. And this is also a dangerous temperature for agriculture. It scorched my parents' garden, and a number of farms near us had failed crops that year. It also taxes our power grid as ACs get cranked up to accommodate, and we had to have some rolling blackouts and brownouts. Unfortunately, this wasn't a fluke high temperature. So temperatures have been creeping steadily up, not only in Sacramento, but around the globe as Earth's climate changes. SMUD, which is Sacramento's municipal utility district, essentially our power supplier, is currently at 15% clean renewable energy in its electricity supply mix, which is unfortunately not a sustainable ratio. The vast majority of their energy comes from biomass and fossil fuels, which create emissions that contribute to warming, which is then creating this poisonous cycle as we all have to use more electricity just to stay comfortable in this hotter and hotter summer. Unfortunately, if the US doesn't invest in finding sustainable alternatives to emissions-heavy energy sources, Sacramento isn't going to remain the city of trees. Our agriculture is going to have to move elsewhere, and children are not going to be able to spend summer days playing or swimming outside. It's simply going to be too hot for that. That's why it's necessary for us to invest now in finding sustainable and prosperous, in finding sustainable and effective energy solutions so that Sacramento can continue to have a prosperous future. So that's an example of a story. It's not a perfect story. I'm not perfect, but you can see that there's exposition setting the scene. There's conflict as we start to deal with the heat of climate change. And as our city electric supplier struggles to find enough renewable clean energy to meet demand. And then there is a resolution. It's an unhappy resolution in the future where Sacramento is no longer a city with trees and a city with agriculture, or even a city where children can play outside because unfortunately the heat's just gotten worse and worse. However, please don't feel limited to following that type of story. You're welcome to be creative. We would love to hear your ideas when we all come back together. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I'll quickly take any